this will probably be one of my most controversial videos because I'm going to tell you the story of the creation of the State of Israel up to its declaration of independence, as well as the creation of the Palestinian refugee problem that the Arabs call the Nakba, or catastrophe, which is the central myth girding the national movement and identity of the Palestinians. I should note that here I am using the word myth in its academic context, that is referring to a shared story about how or why something is the way it is, rather than the colloquial usage which refers to something more like fake or imaginary. I have spent years studying the subject now, and I can say pretty confidently that neither side's popular narrative is completely in line with the facts, but I also feel pretty confidently in saying that one side's narrative is much closer to the facts, and I think you will see which side that is throughout the course of this video. My name is Grant, and you are watching Casual Historian. Let's get started. In early 1947, the British decided to give up control of Palestine and hand the issue to the United Nations. After months of studies and interviews, it was determined that partition was the only viable solution for long-term peace. The next 3 months saw the Jews lobbying countries for support, with the final vote occurring on November 29, 1947, which saw the UN General Assembly vote in favor of Resolution 181. The Arab states, as well as the leaders of the Arab Higher Committee, who are the international representatives of the Arab Palestinians, rejected the partition deal. Some historians, like Ilan Pappy, have tried covering for Arab intransigence by claiming that they wanted to, quote, solve the situation through a much longer process of negotiation, completely ignoring the fact that between the period of which the Special Committee's report had been published and the actual UN General Assembly vote, the Arab states did not spend that time in diplomacy, negotiating, or politicking, but instead actively preparing for armed conflict. In 1946, the Arab states held a conference in Blouda, Syria, where they agreed to allow their private citizens to actively inhibit the establishment of a Jewish state by whatever means they saw fit. And when the Special Committee came to Palestine in the spring of 1947, the Arab Higher Committee actively boycotted it, while the Arab League only allowed limited access to a pre-selected group of officials who read from a script rather than answer questions. The Arab leaders would tell the Jewish Agency that the League would only accept a unified Palestine under the rule of the Grand Mufti, and that the Jews should just accept their fate. After the Special Committee's report, the League met in Sofar, Lebanon, where they created a secret military committee that would raise funds and purchase arms for the Arab militants, while the Saudis assured them that Western oil companies would lobby on their behalf against support for partition. Around the same time as the Sofar meeting, Chairman Azam Pasha met with David Horowitz and Abba Eban of the Jewish Agency in London. The Jews are a fait accompli in the Middle East. Sooner or later, the Arabs will have to reconcile themselves to the fact and accept it. You Arabs cannot wipe out over 500,000 people. We, for our part, are genuinely desirous of an agreement with the Arabs and are prepared to make sacrifices for one. The Arab world is not in a compromising mood. It's likely, Mr. Horowitz, that your plan is rational and logical, but the fate of nations is not decided by rational logic. Nations never concede. They fight. You won't get anything by peaceful means or compromise. You can, perhaps, get something, but only by force of arms. We shall try to defeat you. I'm not sure we'll succeed, but we'll try. We were able to drive out the Crusaders, but on the other hand, we lost Spain and Persia. It may be that we shall lose Palestine, but it's too late to talk of peaceful solutions. An agreement is only acceptable on our terms. The Arab world regards you as invaders and is ready to fight you. The conflict of interest among nations is, for the most part, not amenable to anything except an armed clash. We don't need economic development with your assistance. We have only one test, the test of strength. The League held another meeting in Alay, Lebanon in October of 1947, where they created a unified command, promising to mobilize and deploy troops to their respective borders with Palestine. Syrian volunteers even tried to enter Palestine later that month, but were driven out by British forces in the north. As can be seen by the multiple meetings, the Jews were also trying to come to an amicable solution with the Arabs. But when it became clear that they became more stubborn when acting in concert, the Jews would try to peel one of the Arab states away from the coalition. To the Zionists, King Abdullah of Jordan was seen as the most rational, and his army, the Arab Legion, was the strongest of the Arab states, having been trained, armed, and commanded by British officers. So David Ben-Gurion would send Golda Meir to secretly meet with the king. Abdullah told them that he would not take part in the war against the Jews, citing their mutual animosity towards Amin al-Husseini. But he still didn't support an independent Jewish state, instead offering them autonomy within a greater Syrian kingdom he hoped to form. Obviously, the Jewish agency wasn't interested, but they were amenable to Jordan taking control of the Arab portions of the partition plan. Abdullah would also promise to forbid any other Arab state from passing their forces through Jordanian territory. This meeting between the Jordanians and the Jewish agency has fostered decades worth of conspiracy theories, especially in the Arab world, alleging that King Abdullah was secretly working with the West in order to create a Jewish state. But the evidence here clearly shows that there was no conspiracy to create a Jewish state. What it is evidence of, however, is that everyone hated Amin al-Husseini. The Mufti saw ruling Palestine as his inalienable right, and feared that the Arab League was trying to keep him out of power. Husseini had helped to incite revolts against the British in both Palestine and Iraq, and during World War II he collaborated with the Nazis by producing Arab-language propaganda, recruiting Balkan Muslims into the SS, as well as pressuring the minor Axis powers into sending their Jews to Auschwitz. And although he did not give Hitler the idea for the final solution, testimony from the Nuremberg trial shows he tried to take credit for it anyways. Given all of this, the Arab leaders saw the Mufti, at best, as a problematic figure whose presence and activism within the pan-Arab and pan-Islamic movements made their working with the West more difficult. The October meeting in Alais had explicitly not invited the Mufti, who decided to crash it anyways and demanded that they set up a Palestine government in exile under his leadership. But the League refused. Iraq cannot cooperate with the Mufti in any way whatsoever because it is convinced that he seriously failed the Palestinian cause and led it from one failure to another. He was personally responsible for this disaster. And although he would be denied his government in exile, the Mufti would proceed with his own plans to control Palestine. The Arab Higher Committee approved the creation of national committees who would orchestrate political and military action against partition. Part of this campaign included the assassination of anti-Mufti Arabs. Husseini feared that any post-war settlement that didn't involve him in charge would result in Palestine being carved up by the neighboring Arab powers. So on the eve of the vote, he asked an associate in Haifa to arrange secret talks between himself and the Jewish agency. But after everything the Mufti had done, the Jewish agency had zero trust in him and rejected his offer to talk. Around the same time, a meeting allegedly occurred between King Abdullah and Ismail Rajib Khalidi, an activist for the Arab-Palestinian cause, who asked the king for support, but had been unwilling to give it. And in this exchange, King Abdullah allegedly said to him, "You Palestinians have refused my offer. You deserve what happens to you." I bring up this story with suspicion due to its source, that being Columbia University professor Rashid Khalidi, the author of The 100 Years' War on Palestine, who served as a propagandist for Yasser Arafat for 20 years. I've mentioned in previous videos why I don't trust him, from his decontextualization of history to his thinly veiled anti-Semitism. He recounts this story in the aforementioned book, for which there are no corroborating sources. Ismail Rajib Khalidi was Rashid Khalidi's father, and he allegedly told his son this story after the outbreak of the Six-Day War, 20 years after the exchange allegedly happened. Now that doesn't necessarily mean the whole story is a fabrication, but King Abdullah's lines feel a bit too on the nose to have been real. It's also weird because the story doesn't prove what Khalidi thinks it proves, that being that there was some grand conspiracy against the Palestinians. And it's not the first time in that book that he comes to one of these weird conclusions, but that's a story for another time. In any case, if it is real, it's more proof that the failure to establish a Palestinian state, or for Palestinians to not have to live under Israeli occupation, is the fault of the Arab states and the Palestinians themselves. They had numerous ways out, but they refused to allow any compromise that would let the Jews have a state of their own. And the passage of Resolution 181 would see the Arabs reject yet another way out. The resolution gave the British till August 1st, 1948 to pull out of Palestine and hand over governance to the Jewish agency and the Arabs. It recommended that Palestine be immediately reopened to Jewish immigration, and that the British cooperate with the UN during the transition period. The General Assembly would create the UN Commission on Palestine to oversee this process, but they quickly discovered the British were not in the mood to help. They had already begun evacuating the families of soldiers and other personnel in 1946, and they announced their decision to withdraw by May 15, 1948. just 4 days after the resolution was passed. They refused to endorse the resolution, hoping to maintain good relations with the Arabs and Muslim states, who were its biggest suppliers of oil, as well as wanting to retain control of the Suez Canal. They also believed that the Arabs would win the impending war, and the British were far from the only foreign power to hold these positions. Due to its relative inexperience compared to their counterparts in London, the careerists in the US State Department typically followed Whitehall's lead on Middle Eastern issues, including the desire to appease the Arabs. It took little time for the State Department to begin undermining President Truman's public support for partition. With Truman's support, they suspended the sale of weapons to all parties in the region. The intent, at least from Truman himself, was to portray the US as a neutral arbiter in the region's disputes. But this policy failed to take into account the British putting its thumb on the scale in favor of the Arabs, by not only continuing to block Jewish immigration into Palestine, but also banning the importation of weapons, while continuing to sell weapons to the Arab states, who were then allowed to smuggle them to the Arab militias. President Truman quickly realized that just because the General Assembly passed a resolution, the UN Security Council wasn't obligated to implement it. The Zionists, more than anyone else, were aware of the UN's inability to enforce its decisions. The UN resolution had stark limitations. It had contributed decisively to the British departure. It had exalted Jewish morale. It had given advanced legitimacy to a Jewish state that would arise by force of its own responsibility and sacrifice, but it did not assure survival. On the challenges they faced, Chaim Weizmann wrote in his autobiography, which was published shortly after the resolution's passage, "The Jewish people, and particularly the Zionists, face a very great challenge. Before another year is over, we must found a Jewish state. We must prepare a constitution, set up a government, organize our defense, and begin to reconstruct the present national home so as to make it capable of absorbing, according to the plan, some 6,000 to 8,000 immigrants a month." Moshe Dayan, then a member of the Palmach, soon to be fighting on the front lines, would recount in his own memoirs, "I felt in my bones the victory of Judaism, which for 2,000 years of exile from the land of Israel had withstood persecutions, the Spanish Inquisition, pogroms, anti-Jewish decrees, restrictions, and the mass slaughter by the Nazis in our own generation, and had read the fulfillment of its age-old yearning, the return of a free and independent Zion." There wasn't universal support for partition amongst the Zionists. The revisionists rejected the plan because they envisioned the Jewish state not just including the entirety of the Palestine Mandate, but also including the entirety of Jordan, which had been part of the Palestine Mandate until 1922. The Jewish Agency and labor Zionists accepted the principle of the partition plan, but hoped to renegotiate the borders to incorporate the Jewish communities left outside of the Jewish state, especially Jerusalem, which was the single largest Jewish population center in the country. As the British prepared to pull out, government services would begin to break down. The Jewish Agency was already prepared to take over most of these local government functions in the areas the Haganah controlled, and many of the isolated agricultural settlements never received these services to begin with, and were thus self-sufficient. David Ben-Gurion would meet with High Commissioner Alan Cunningham, requesting copies of all legal documents and land deeds held by the mandatory government, so the agency could continue enforcing property laws, but the British refused. Ben-Gurion began a rapid reorganization of the Haganah, preparing them to capture and occupy all the territory allotted to them in the partition, and fortify their borders. By December of 1947, the Palmach had about 3,000 soldiers, with the Irgun and Lehi having another 5 and 1,000 respectively, with the Haganah having about 21,000, giving the Zionists about 30,000 potential fighters. Jewish settlement police were building trenches, bunkers, and barbed wire fences. The Haganah had pistols, rifles, machine guns, and some mortars, but lacked tanks, artillery, and military aircraft. They also established the Red Shield of David, which would eventually become the Israeli branch of the International Red Cross. The Haganah were also active in the detention camps on Cyprus, where they would train Jewish detainees until they were allowed to enter Palestine. The Jewish Agency would also begin conscripting 17 to 19-year-olds for Haganah service, including women, who were given an exemption if they chose. The drive would be quite successful, with 72% of those called into service doing so by February of 1948. The Jewish Agency would also continue reaching out to Arab communities across Palestine, hoping to avoid as much conflict as possible. If the Arab citizen will feel at home in our state, if the state will help him in a truthful and dedicated way to reach the economic, social, and cultural level of the Jewish community, then Arab distrust will accordingly subside, and a bridge will be built to a Semitic Jewish-Arab alliance. Back in October, before the General Assembly vote, agents of Shai, the Haganah's intelligence unit, would reach out to the leaders of the anti-Mufti militias from the Arab Revolt, whom they would provide funds and arms in order to fight the Mufti's forces. Moshe Dayan was placed in charge of Arab intelligence, recruiting friendly Arabs to spy on the Mufti's forces, along with Mizrahi Jews to spy inside of Arab capitals. Some Arab villages would side with the Jews out of hatred for the Husseinis or out of rivalry with other tribes that had sided with the Husseinis. The Druze were also more likely to side with the Zionists, while the Christian Arabs were more likely to remain neutral, seeing the Palestinian national movement as being far too friendly with Islamists. But as we covered earlier, the Arabs were already in the process of preparing for the war by the time the vote had occurred, and that process would continue apace afterwards. Musa Alami of the Arab Office, who had been one of the few moderate voices amongst the Arab Palestinians, had criticized the Mufti for rejecting the 1939 White Paper due to it not granting Palestine immediate independence. Alami would endorse the partition as a starting point for further negotiations, but this would lead to a falling out with the Arab Higher Committee and the League. And I would like to take a moment to thank all of the people who have endorsed Casual Historian by becoming a channel member or patron, especially my producer level patron, Ryan Powers, as well as the newest channel member, Stefan. Their support helps keep the channel going when sponsors or the algorithm don't feel like giving the videos a fair shake, and I would love to be able to rely more on the direct support of viewers than on AdSense. Supporters get access to a number of perks such as an exclusive Discord, early access to ad and censorship-free versions of the videos, as well as exclusive videos, as well as getting your name in the scrolling chyron at the end of videos. And depending on what tier or level you join at, you also get access to the scripts I use to make these videos, as well as the notes I use to write those scripts. But at the end of the day, I know most people who support me as well as any other creator do so because they like what we make and they want to see us make more of it and make it better. And with your support, we can. So if you believe you get a lot out of these videos and you have the means to do so, then become a channel supporter by either clicking the join button down below the video or by going to patreon.com/casualhistorian to pick a tier that's right for you. Thanks again to all my channel members and patrons for sponsoring this video, but for now, let's get back to the history. Most Arabs would reject the resolution, claiming that it was immoral to make the Arabs an ethnic minority in their own homeland. Arab governments began pressuring oil companies to lobby their home governments against partition. They threatened to stop work on oil pipelines or cancel oil concessions unless the US government reversed its position. The Arab League would petition the International Court of Justice to rule on whether the UN General Assembly had the right to partition a country, which it would narrowly rule in favor of. The Arab League would meet in Cairo shortly after the vote. The Arab states felt unprepared for war and wanted to postpone the fighting until the Arab armies were fully mobilized, fearing premature action would give the Zionists an advantage. Iraq was alone in advocating swift intervention, while Jordan advocated that they alone should be the ones to intervene. But the Syrians and Egyptians suspected Jordan's plan to unilaterally intervene was just a pretext to annex Palestine for itself. The reality is that most Arab leaders preferred some kind of accommodation with the Jews and privately had more or less accepted partition as a fait accompli, but they publicly condemned it so long as the Palestinian leadership itself continued to call for blood, which backed them into a corner. They felt as if they were being dragged into a war they had no chance of winning. Poor Palestine. No matter what I say about defending it, my heart remains a seething volcano because I cannot convince anyone of importance in my country or in the rest of the Arab countries that it needs anything more than words. Because we have a small and ill-equipped army, we cannot stand up to the Zionist forces if they should suddenly decide to launch a strike at Damascus. The Arab Higher Committee quickly went to work stoking the flames, calling for a general strike in hopes of giving the pro-Mufti militias time to gather inside Palestine. Husseini hoped to gain control of the entirety of the country before the British evacuated in order to preempt direct intervention by the Arab states. We do not fear the Jews. We would have many losses, but in the end, we must win. They will eventually crumble into nothing, and we do not fear the result, unless of course Britain or America or some other great power intervenes. Even then we shall fight, and the Arab world will be perpetually hostile. The Jews in Palestine wouldn't be the only targets of Arab and Muslim violence, as the Arab states themselves made threats against the Jews in their own countries. The lives of 1 million Jews in Muslim countries would be jeopardized by the establishment of a Jewish state. If a satisfactory solution of the Palestine case was not reached, severe measures should be taken against all Jews in Arab countries. Anti-Jewish pogroms erupt across the Arab world. The Syrian government would actively incite violence against Jews and Western consulates. Crowds in Damascus call for jihad against Jews, while mobs in Aleppo burn down 11 synagogues and murder 73 Jews. Most of the Jews in Syria would flee to neighboring Turkey, Lebanon, and Palestine. Yemeni Jews fled to the capital of Aden to escape pogroms in their home villages, but British police and soldiers would eventually allow Muslim mobs to attack and slaughter 82 of them. 130 Jews would be killed in Tripoli, while Jewish homes, shops, and synagogues would be looted and burned in Bahrain, Baghdad, Beirut, Cairo, and Alexandria. The Ulema of Al-Azhar University in Cairo would proclaim a global jihad to liberate Palestine from the Jews. On November 30th, 1947, the Arab Higher Committee would publish a manifesto with the intent to incite the Arabs of Palestine into violent action. Kingdoms are established over dead bodies and skulls. Palestine is our land. We were born in it, we have lived in it, and we shall die in it. We shall meet the faces of Allah with smiles, warm hearts, and satisfied souls. The same day this manifesto was published, Arab bandits, led by a Hassan Salameh, attacked a pair of buses near Petah Tikva with machine guns and grenades. The Higher Committee's strike would begin on December 2nd, but the event quickly escalated into riots, with Arab mobs attacking Jewish pedestrians, looting stores, and burning down homes, all done in broad daylight in sight of British police, who refused to intervene. When Haganah members showed up to protect Jewish lives and property, the British would arrest them for illegal possession of weapons, and then proceed to give the confiscated arms to the Arab crowds. For a long time, the police did not interfere in this little mob, which could have been dispersed not with a whiff of grape shot, but with a swish of canes. And it was heartbreaking to see these young hooligans being given a free hand to destroy the product of man's labor at a time when we were so short of everything. The apathy of the police gave the impression of approval. What was interesting, though beastly, was that the street boys who pillaged the shop obviously had orders not to take the goods away, as they tore the shoes to pieces or cut holes in them with knives and iron stakes. It was organized hatred with a vengeance. Arab bands attack a kibbutz near neighborhoods in Tel Aviv, which the Haganah managed to beat back, only then to be attacked by British troops. Our old friend Ilan Pappy portrays the series of events that have happened since the partition vote as the Jews beginning their genocidal campaign. The ethnic cleansing began in early December 1947 with a series of Jewish attacks on Palestinian villages and neighborhoods in retaliation for the buses and shopping centers that had been vandalized in the Palestinian protest against the UN resolution. We see Pappy minimize the violence committed against the Jews as mere vandalism and protests, decontextualizing the events in order to support his narrative. Most historians describe the bus attacks as the first act of violence of the war. Instead, Pappy portrays Jewish retaliation against the violence committed against them as the actual start of the war, and completely ignores the pogroms being enacted against Jewish communities across the Arab world. Again, you really shouldn't read Pappy. He's a propagandist, not a historian. There were various reactions to the outbreak of violence. Some Arabs still hoped that a peaceful solution was still available. Some tried to pass the blame onto the Nazis for inciting Jewish militancy and immigration. Some accused the British, alleging they saw light-skinned men in Arab clothes egging on the crowds. Outside Jerusalem, there were attempts at preempting the violence, with local Jewish and Arab leaders making their own peace agreements, most of which would hold up until about April of 1948. There were Arab villages that turned away Arab fighters who wanted to use their homes as a base of operations, and some would go so far as to invite the Haganah into their villages before Arab militants could arrive. And many Palestinian Arabs responded to the violence by fleeing the country long before the Jews even had a chance to retaliate. Most Palestinian communities in Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt were founded in the 1930s by those fleeing Arab-on-Arab violence during the Revolt. And when fighting started up again in late 1947, many of them fled the country again, returning to these same places. The first to leave were Arabs living in majority Jewish areas, followed by wealthy Arab merchants who hoped to wait out the war. This was followed by flight from urban areas, most fleeing to Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon, and later on more would flee from villages and towns and areas that had been allotted to the Jewish state in the partition plan. Most, however, would flee to areas that had been given to the Arabs in the partition plan. But of course, there were those who sought to drown Palestine in blood. When our nation starts a fight, it doesn't look forward to its conclusion. We will start and we will not stop until victory has been achieved and our enemy has been thrown into the sea. The Arab states had difficulty responding to the violence due to all of their conflicting interests. The Egyptians were preoccupied with negotiating the withdrawal of British troops from its territory and potentially annexing Sudan. King Abdullah of Jordan had territorial ambitions, wanting to annex Palestine in order to obtain ports in the Mediterranean and potentially absorb the economic dynamism of the Jews. He also had hopes of realizing the Hashemite dream of a greater Syria denied to his brother after the First World War. Saudi Arabia also had its own eyes on Jordanian territory, while Syria wanted to annex Lebanon. All the Arab leaders distrusted each other, and they all despised the Mufti, who despised them in kind. The League's Cairo summit continued through the outbreak of violence. The League would create a joint command committee that would be headquartered in Syria and headed by the Iraqi general Ismail Safwat Pasha, with the field command given to Fazi al-Kawukji, a leader from the 1936 revolt who served as a colonel in the Wehrmacht during World War II. His initial fighting force had no Palestinian Arabs in it, and consisted mostly of Syrians, veterans of the SS, Spanish phalangists, along with Yugoslavian and Soviet Muslims. The volunteers would receive arms and training in Syria, and eventually be sent into Palestine to set up or join militias across the country. This fighting force would be dubbed the Arab Liberation Army. The Arabs who came to fight in Palestine had numerous motivations and loyalties. Some were motivated by Islamism, others by Pan-Arabism, and others were motivated by anti-Semitism and Arab supremacism. And as much as the Arab League disliked the Mufti, they couldn't completely ignore him. So Palestine would be divided into 3 zones, with the northern zone left to the Arab Liberation Army, the central zone, which contained Jerusalem, given to the Mufti, while a southern zone was left to the Egyptians and their proxies in the Muslim Brotherhood. As ALA forces trickled into Palestine, foreign observers noticed that they paled in comparison to the Haganah. British officials began to suspect that Arab League involvement was perfunctory rather than decisive. I cannot escape the conclusion that the Arab League has no clear idea of the outcome of its present action, and has taken it merely to save face in view of past utterances. It is apparently accepted that partition cannot be prevented. The present policy of the League therefore can only lead to the destruction of Palestine, which will undoubtedly bring much suffering and loss of life to both Palestinian Arabs and Jews. Has the League really got the interests of the Palestinian Arabs at heart? Although the League agreed to let the Mufti control Jerusalem, they would do everything they could to minimize his chances of success. League agents would purchase weapons at discounted prices in Cairo and then sell them to the Palestinian militias at exorbitant prices. And the ALA preferred to not let the Palestinian Arabs into their ranks, seeing them more as a nuisance than as useful soldiers. They would have preferred to keep them as guides in the country and to utilize their villages to resupply their armies. Among those loyal to the Mufti were the Al-Fatuwa, led by Amin al-Husseini's nephew, Abd al-Qadr, who had also served in the Wehrmacht during World War II. Al-Qadr's lieutenants would mostly act independently, giving the Mufti little operational oversight. Opposed to the Mufti were the Al-Najada, who were supported by the notable families of the city of Jaffa. Early in the war, both pro- and anti-Mufti militias would target isolated Jewish settlements. In urban areas, they resorted to more traditional terrorist tactics, relying on bombs and snipers, with an Arab SS veteran as the Mufti's chief bomb maker. These tactics would gradually lose effectiveness as the Jewish agency began to set up checkpoints and barricades between Jewish and Arab neighborhoods. The increasing rate of violence led to Jewish employees of the Mandate government refusing to return to work, with local Jewish councils demanding new police offices be established in their neighborhoods to protect them. But the British refused, claiming it might stoke more anger amongst the Arabs. In Jerusalem, Jews were being kidnapped in broad daylight outside government buildings, with Muslim employees refusing to report the incidents. And the few that did return to work were accused by Arab co-workers of secretly planting bombs in order to kill them. In Haifa, the Jewish mayor attempted to negotiate a ceasefire with the local National Council in order to preempt violence, but they refused. We have been toiling day and night to maintain quiet and to implement a high, unified Arab policy, regardless of the incitement by Jewish traitors. There is no way we can negotiate with the Jews. Let them take care of their interests, and we'll ensure our security. After the partition vote, the revisionists would put most of their focus on anti-Arab reprisal attacks and retaliation for Jewish deaths. Within Lehi, there was a schism between those who believed that the military wing of Lehi should be disbanded due to their goal of assuring British evacuation had been achieved, and those who wanted to maintain it in order to begin fighting the Arabs immediately. Those that believed it should be disbanded would quit the group and join up with the Haganah or the Irgun. Menachem Begin, the head of the Irgun, would later insist that it was the revisionists whom the Arabs truly feared, since it was their war against the British that had convinced London to give up control of Palestine. He also claimed that it was promise of foreign aid that made the Palestinians willing to fight. They were promised that the regular armies of the Arab states would be thrown into the battle to vanquish or destroy the Jews. They anticipated that Tel Aviv, its buildings, and its daughters would be delivered up to the Palestine Arabs. The attitude of respect mingled with fear, which Jewish arms had evoked among all Arabs, had its effects. The Haganah wasn't prepared to deal with the sporadic violence against Jewish communities across the Mandate, especially with the British continuing to hamper their operations. For 2 days now, the peace in the country has been disrupted by shootings, arsons, and murders in various places by agitated Arabs. We have been holding back for the time being since we aspire to peace, good neighborly relations, quiet work, and mutual happiness. But be warned, should the bloodletting continue, we will be forced to take severe measures against the perpetrators of violence and those responsible for the violation of peace. The Haganah had spent the years of the Arab Revolt engaged mostly in defensive actions, only initiating reprisal attacks sparingly. One of the lessons they learned from the revolt was that if they refused to retaliate against Arab aggression, others would, which led to the rise of the Irgun and Lehi. But the Haganah's limited manpower meant it had to be selective, targeting political and economic leaders of the Palestinians, with most of these assassination attempts failing, while distributing leaflets telling the Arabs that if they left the Jews alone, they would be left alone. Hassam Salami had led the first bus attack in December 1947, so the Haganah blew up his house. Salami would retaliate by leading another attack on Tel Aviv, causing 2,000 Jews to flee their homes, with the Haganah eventually driving them out. Despite this, they were still on the defensive across the whole country. Losing the ground war in Palestine weakened the Zionists on the political front. Abba Eban, representing the agency at the UN, warned Tel Aviv that their position was precarious at the Security Council, and when they met with officials of the U.S. State Department, they found that they were reluctant to support partition. Eban would send a message to Chaim Weizmann in London, asking him to return to the U.S. in order to lobby President Truman personally. The Jewish pressures on the White House did not diminish in the days following the partition vote in the UN. Individuals and groups asked me, usually in rather quarrelsome and emotional ways, to stop the Arabs, to keep the British from supporting the Arabs, to furnish American soldiers, to do this, that, and the other. As the pressure mounted, I found it necessary to give instructions that I did not want to be approached by any more spokesmen for the extreme Zionist cause. Truman felt trapped between Zionist activists on one end, demanding more direct support for the creation of a Jewish state, and an entrenched bureaucracy within the State Department that was doing everything within its power to ensure the Zionist project was a failure. Like most of the British diplomats, some of our diplomats also thought that the Arabs, on account of their numbers and the fact that they controlled such immense oil resources, should be appeased. I am sorry to say that there were some among them who were also inclined to be anti-Semitic. Wanting to maintain good relations with the Arabs and reassure them the U.S. was an impartial arbiter, the State Department announced an arms embargo on the region. Truman naively believed he could prevent conflict by depriving both sides of arms, all the while the British continued to sell arms to its Middle Eastern clients, who then sold them to the Palestinians. Truman would also publicly promise not to send American troops to Palestine, but none of these efforts would stop the fighting, which was well underway. The two main theaters of the war were the cities, consisting of snipers and planting bombs, and the roads between settlements, consisting of ambushing cars and convoys delivering people and supplies. And of great importance to all sides was the city of King David. Jerusalem was home to 90,000 Jews, making it the single largest concentration of Jews in Palestine. The city had been set aside for the international zone by the partition resolution, depriving the Jewish state of nearly 20% of the Jewish population, making it one of the borders the Jewish agency anticipated needing to renegotiate. But the city was isolated from the other Jewish population centers and surrounded by Arab villages. Additionally, the city is divided between the newer western half, which was mostly Jewish, and the older half, which was mostly Arab except for the old Jewish quarter of the city. It was mostly home to the ultra-Orthodox rabbis and their families, who ranged between being skeptical to outright opponents of Zionism. And when fighting broke out, they would be among the first attacked by the Arabs, who tried starving them out. The Haganah prepared defensive lines, while the Arabs would attack Red Shield vehicles and personnel traversing the city, setting up their own roadblocks. Government buildings where Jews worked had grenades thrown through the windows, while nearby Arab-owned businesses were left untouched. But as symbolic as Jerusalem was, it was far from the only settlement that saw fighting. All Jews living in Gaza either fled the city or were murdered by Muslim Brotherhood militias, who began to occupy British police and military posts as they withdrew. The nearby Negev was seen as vital territory for the future Jewish settlement, with a handful of settlements already dotting the region. But they needed arms to defend themselves against sporadic attacks, with Ben-Gurion resisting pressures to abandon them, and instead ordering the Haganah and Palmach to secure the supply routes. In central Palestine, Haganah units became mobilized to full-time operations, but because of a lack of manpower, they had to resort to hit-and-run tactics against hostile Arab forces. By and large, both Jews and Arabs took the same general approach to fighting at the time. One side would move into a position and open fire, hoping the enemy would withdraw. But if they stood firm and you started taking casualties, then you would withdraw instead. We see tit-for-tat killing sprees in both Haifa and the Upper Galilee between local Arab mobs and the Haganah and Palmach. In Jaffa, Lehi would detonate a truck bomb outside the city hall, where the local Arab National Committee was headquartered, killing 26. The first month of fighting saw Arabs attack isolated Jewish settlements, but the defenders, better armed and trained, usually beat them back. When that failed, the Arabs focused on attacking the convoys resupplying them. They also sabotaged the telegraph lines, hampering communications between Tel Aviv and isolated settlements. This became known as the Battle of the Roads. The militias aligned with the ALA attacked convoys in the north, while units of the Jordanian Legion began attacking convoys headed to Ben Shemen. While units of the Jordanian Arab Legion, some of which were stationed inside Palestine, would attack convoys headed to Ben Shemen. The Haganah hoped to deter the Arabs from attacking their convoys by attacking Arab vehicles as well, hoping for them to come to some kind of a truce on the roads. But the Arabs had far fewer cars in general, and Arab villages were far less interdependent on each other than Jewish settlements were. Ben-Gurion concluded that they would need to occupy every square inch of territory allotted to them in the partition resolution before the British withdrew. In order to maintain good relations with the Arabs, regardless of what the post-war situation looked like, the British would hand over local police stations, fortifications, and armories to local Arab leaders. But these handovers tended to be less orderly, with rival Arab militias looting them for their weapons. An Iraqi general in the Arab Liberation Army later claimed in his memoirs that he had received an advance schedule for the British withdrawal from Safed and Nebi Yusha, with many local Arab leaders reporting similar instances with the local British authorities. The British would sometimes even redistribute their arsenal before evacuating. The struggle between Arabs and Jews, the dominant factor in the entire life of Palestine during that period, went on amid the indifference of the British authorities and the British troops, who intervened only when they thought the result of battle might affect their own security, which meant, in the majority of cases, supporting the Arab forces to prevent the occupation of their positions by the Jews. As the new year arrived, more and more ALA fighters entered Palestine, with roughly 3,000 making camp in Samaria by the end of the month. These fighters came from around the Arab world, though disproportionately from Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, under the then still absentee command of Fazi al-Kawukji. The 1st Battalion crossed in from Jordan, while the 2nd crossed in from Lebanon, while an Iraqi volunteer battalion also crossed from Jordan in late January and set up camp near Nablus. On January 10, 1948, 200 Arab Liberation Army fighters attacked the Jewish settlement at Kfar Sold, near the Syrian border, but were held off by local Jewish defenders until a British armored unit, under orders from Gordon Macmillan, arrived and helped drive them back across the border into Syria. But in Jordan, the British came to a new policy of allowing Arab volunteers to pass through Jordanian territory, thus violating the promises made by King Abdullah to Golda Meir. Gordon Macmillan had initially been ordered to drive ALA troops out of Palestine, unaware of the secret decision to allow them to cross through. After his encounter with the ALA at Kfar Sold, he received instructions from London not to engage with any foreign armies unless they interfered with the British withdrawal. Al-Kawukji would cross the Jordanian border himself in late January and set up camp in Tiberias. By this point, he had 4,000 men under his command, most of whom were either former soldiers or policemen from other Arab countries, along with veterans of numerous Arab revolts. In central Palestine, between Jerusalem and Hebron, was a collection of settlements known as the Etzion Bloc, founded by Yemenite Jews in the 1920s, and from mid-December 1947 to May 15, 1948, they would hold out against a near constant stream of attacks by neighboring Arab militias. In January, a convoy of 35 was sent to reinforce the Gush settlement. The convoy passed a pair of Arab women on the side of the road, and upon sighting the Jewish vehicles, they fled back to their village, and the convoy commander would make the decision to not pursue the women. Not long after, the convoy came under attack by hundreds of Arab militiamen, who managed to surround them on a wooded hill. After hours of fighting, there were only 3 Jewish fighters left, who decided to kill themselves with a grenade rather than allow themselves to be tortured by the Arabs. When British soldiers arrived at the scene to collect the bodies, they found that they had all been mutilated, with their eyes gouged out and their genitals cut off. The corpses' mouths had the missing penises shoved inside them, and their testicles filling the eye sockets. There had been one Jewish woman in this convoy, but her body was never found. Women had been allowed to join the Haganah, including for combat roles, but as stories of them being murdered and raped reached Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, they were pulled away from frontline action. While fighting escalated on the ground in January of 1948, the politicians continued their work of lobbying and diplomacy. Golda Meir was sent to the U.S. to raise money from American Jews in order to buy arms for the Haganah. Anti-partitionists within the State Department worked to prevent the UN Security Council from enforcing partition. They wanted to avoid sparking any conflict that might give the Soviets an excuse to intervene. In February, the Arab Liberation Army began attacking the Jewish quarter of Safed and numerous nearby settlements, despite a promise Kawukji had made to the British to not attack the Jews before they had pulled out. The Palmach also took initiative around this time, blowing up the Sheikh Hussein Bridge, which cut the ALA off from their reinforcements in Syria. Despite this, by the end of February, the Arab Liberation Army was 7,000 strong. By this time, most Arabs living in western Jerusalem had fled, including those living in Arab-majority neighborhoods. The Mufti's loyalists were active, with militias blocking the roads into Jerusalem to prevent the delivery of food into the city, while Arab snipers shot at Jews who were waiting in bread lines. The British were still in Jerusalem, and they did whatever they could to hamper the Haganah, with one incident seeing them confiscate the arms carried by 4 members, and then proceeded to hand those men and the weapons over to the Arab mobs, who then proceeded to lynch the Jews that were handed over to them. Al-Qadr would recruit British deserters to pull off a terrorist attack. They loaded a truck with TNT and parked it in front of the office of the Palestine Post newspaper. And on February 1st, they blew up much of the building, killing at least 1 Jew. The headline story of the next issue read, "The truth is louder than TNT and burns brighter than the flames of arson." Al-Qadr would use British deserters to plant more car bombs, such as on February 22nd, when they left 3 stolen vehicles in front of the Atlantic Hotel on Ben Yehuda Street, leveling 4 buildings and killing 58 people. When it was discovered British citizens were involved in the attack, Irgun and Lehi retaliated by killing 16 British policemen and soldiers. The Zionists would take more offensive actions outside Jerusalem, with the Palmach planting a car bomb in Haifa that killed 30 Arabs, in retaliation for other Arab car bombs, while Lehi would use a bomb to derail a train carrying British troops from Cairo, killing 27. On the political front, the British allegedly gave King Abdullah of Jordan the green light to invade Palestine. By February of 1948, the British believed, at best, the Jews would lose most of the territory allotted to them and would be left with a coastal enclave around Tel Aviv that would be completely dependent on the UK or US for its survival. But King Abdullah was of the opposite opinion, believing that if something weren't done soon, the Jews would take control of all of Palestine due to their better training and experienced institutions that could function as an interim government until elections were held. Arab elites who had fled Palestine had been lobbying the king and his government to intervene before it was too late. The Americans spent February looking for alternatives to partition, with the Secretary of State George Marshall and Ambassador Warren Austin warning the UN Security Council that the situation in Palestine was a threat to global peace. The Arab League would meet again in Cairo, where the fight over the Mufti's role would flare again. The Lebanese delegation tried to get a new leader to represent the Palestinians, while the Arab Higher Committee insisted that they would only accept the Mufti as their leader. In a secret meeting, the League would basically take over all functions of the Palestinian national movement with their Palestine Committee. By the end of March, Fazi al-Kawukji had 7,000 fighters under his control in northern Palestine. Al-Qadr had 5,000 in central Palestine, and the Egyptian-backed Muslim Brotherhood had 2,000 in the south. The Bedouins, Christian Arabs, and Druze were less interested in fighting the Jews, fearing they would be the Arab Muslims' next target after the Jews were dealt with. They were Druze mercenaries working for the ALA near Haifa in the Lower Galilee, but after a few clashes with the Palmach, Druze leaders had a secret meeting with Moshe Dayan, with most of them agreeing to either pull out of the war entirely or to switch sides to the Zionists. In Jerusalem, Al-Qadr recruited an Arab Christian who worked as a chauffeur for the American consulate. He was able to use his credentials to drive an American diplomatic car and park it right in front of the Jewish agency building. It would have destroyed the building if a Jewish guard hadn't gotten into the car and reparked it across the street because it was blocking the entrance. But it would still explode, killing 12 people in the Jewish National Fund building instead. By this point, the British had become so derelict in their duty in enforcing law and order that foreign consulates ceased to interact with the Mandate government, and instead, whenever they had a problem, they would interact either with the Jewish agency or local Arab leaders. Chaim Weizmann would return to New York in February and began meeting with leaders of other Zionist organizations, as well as friendly politicians and officials, looking for someone to pull enough strings to get him a meeting with President Truman. Frank Goldman, president of B'nai B'rith, would get Weizmann in touch with Eddie Jacobson, a Jewish friend and former business partner of Harry Truman. Meanwhile, the Zionists were trying to get the blame for the conflict formally placed on the Arabs in UN records, with Abba Eban working with Bolivian delegate Raul Mendoza. A General Assembly report would read, Arab opposition to the plan of the Assembly of 1947 has taken the form of organized efforts by strong Arab elements, both inside and outside Palestine, to prevent its implementation and to thwart its objectives by threats and acts of violence, including repeated armed incursions into Palestine territory. The Commission has had to report to the Security Council that powerful Arab interests, both inside and outside Palestine, are defying the resolution of the General Assembly and are engaged in a deliberate effort to alter by force the settlement envisaged therein. At this time, the Arab delegations tended to be dismissive of the UN's resolutions. I failed to find in this charter any text which implies, directly or indirectly, that the General Assembly has the authority to enforce its own recommendations by military force. The General Assembly only gives advice, and the parties to whom advice is addressed accept it when it is rightful and just, and when it does not impair their fundamental rights. The UN was also active on the ground in Palestine, or at least they tried to be. In March, the Palestine Committee would send an advance team in order to help set things up for the partition process, but the British would actively hamper their progress. The British want to create a vacuum in Palestine, but they refuse to hand the vacuum over to us. At one point during the advance team's stay, their food supply was cut off due to the Arab siege of West Jerusalem, and the Jewish agency would provide the UN commissioners food from their own dwindling supplies. Like all the commissions in the past, the Arab Higher Committee refused to cooperate with the commission, while the agency sent liaisons to assist them. What I particularly appreciated was the moderation they displayed in refusing to exploit unduly the manifest advantage which the vacuum created by the Arab boycott gave them to influence our opinion. The situation on the ground made the U.S. more skeptical about the feasibility of partition, with the State Department, Defense Department, and the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency all pushing for the administration to abandon it. But the White House itself still supported partition, with a pair of Truman's advisors, David Niles and Clark Clifford, writing the president a memo arguing against state, defense, and CIA assessments. They argued that not getting involved provided just as much excuse for a Soviet intervention as getting involved did, and having the Jewish state allied to them was preferable to having them allied with the Soviets. But Truman had grown tired of the seemingly constant lobbying of the Zionists, especially when they had the nerve to also work with his opponents in the Republican Party. After weeks of dodging requests to meet with any Zionist representative, he began speaking about it with his old business partner, Eddie Jacobson. The situation has been a headache for me for 2.5 years. The Jews are so emotional and the Arabs are so difficult to talk with that it is almost impossible to get anything done. The British, of course, have been exceedingly non-cooperative in arriving at a conclusion. The Zionists have expected a big stick approach on our part, and naturally have been disappointed when we could not do that. I hope it will work out all right, but I have come to the conclusion that the situation is not solvable as presently set up. Abba Eban would later complain about Truman's attitude in his own memoir half a century later. In objective terms, Truman's attitude was preposterous. His government was at the center of an explosive international crisis, and here he was refusing to even have discourse with one of the parties in the dispute on the trivial grounds that he found them personally abrasive. His attitude was that if you are a president of the United States, you can decide for yourself with whom you will and will not speak. Jacobson would appeal to Truman by comparing Weizmann to one of Truman's own heroes. I have never met the man who has been my hero all my life, but I have studied his past as you have studied Jackson's. He is the greatest Jew alive, perhaps the greatest Jew who ever lived. You yourself have told me that he is a great statesman and a fine gentleman. I am talking about Dr. Chaim Weizmann. He is an old man and a very sick man. He has traveled thousands of miles to see you, and now you are putting off seeing him. That isn't like you. Harry eventually agrees to meet with Weizmann at the White House on March 18th, but the meeting needed to be secret, with Chaim brought in through a side entrance as to not be noticed by the media. Weizmann tells Truman about all the agricultural projects going on in Palestine, while imploring him that all of these and future projects are dependent on American support for partition. Truman explains his lack of full-throated endorsement was about trying to avoid bloodshed, fearing the Jews couldn't win a direct conflict with Arab armies. But at the end, the president tells Weizmann that he still backed partition. But this private promise would soon be publicly undermined. President Truman hadn't informed the State Department about his meeting with Weizmann, and because of this, they continued to act on his previous instructions to seek a UN trusteeship over Palestine. News of these developments resulted in the White House being bombarded by petitions, letters, and protests. The UN Secretary General protested the U.S. proposal, saying it would harm the UN's reputation to go back on a resolution in the face of violence. The announcement had come the day after Truman's meeting with Weizmann. Abba Eban saw the proposal as the U.S. and Truman turning against partition, with his later memoir interpreting Truman's behavior as the president distrusting both the Zionists and his State Department. Truman claims the trustee proposal was only intended to be a temporary measure to calm the situation in Palestine until a peaceful resolution could be found. But most diplomats around the world saw the proposal as a rejection of the partition plan altogether. The idea of the partition of Palestine was already too deeply ingrained in the international conscience for it to be destroyed either by good polemicists or by good generals. And besides, the Arabs had neither one nor the other. Truman himself would later blame an entrenched State Department bureaucracy that was trying to enact its own policies for the confusion. The difficulty with many career officials in the government is that they regard themselves as the men who really make policy and run the government. They look upon the elected officials as just temporary occupants. Too often, career men seek to impose their own views instead of carrying out the established policy of the administration. By the end of March, the White House publicly reiterated its support for partition and called for a ceasefire instead of a trusteeship. And if Patreon or channel memberships are too much of a commitment, then I would call on you to support the channel in other ways. You could also give me a one-time contribution via PayPal, or you could buy me a book from my Amazon wishlist, both of which are linked down in the description below. Thanks for getting this far through the video, so I guess I should let you get back to the history. Back in Palestine, the war for the roads continued. The Haganah and Palmach's failure to effectively protect their convoys would require a change in strategy. They needed to take out the Arab militias and their bases, which meant targeting Arab villages. Thus would begin Operation Nashon and Plan Dalet. And this is where we address the allegations of genocide or ethnic cleansing. When anti-Zionist writers talk about Plan Dalet, they talk about it as if it was the Israeli Wannsee Conference, the 1942 meeting of senior Nazis, where they formalized the final solution as state policy. They alleged that the Zionist policy was to eliminate all Arabs from Israeli territory by whatever means necessary. This explanation of Plan Dalet reveals a kind of fundamental misunderstanding of what Plan Dalet actually was. Whereas the Wannsee Conference was a documented meeting of Nazi leaders coming to a conclusion on what they should do with the Jews, Plan Dalet was a collection of policy documents and memos written by different peoples at different times, often with contradictory instructions on how to secure the territory allotted to the Jews in the partition plan. In practice, it was a set of guidelines which gave the Haganah and Palmach ample leeway to determine the best means of securing their objectives. The plan called for taking control of vital towns and villages that intersected with roads and communication lines, or might be used as bases for the enemy. Sometimes this meant relocating the people in a town or village and razing it to the ground, and other times they were left alone so long as their leaders promised not to interfere with the Haganah, or to not aid the Arabs hostile to them. And the commanders on the ground were given authority to determine which town or village fell into which category. If the village had a history of aiding the Mufti's militias, or the Haganah was attacked by people inside the village, the commanders were likely to order the village be evacuated. And if the village had a history of keeping to itself, they'd usually be left alone. But that's not to say that there weren't Zionists who had proposed expelling all Arabs from Palestine. Theodor Herzl himself toyed with the idea of transferring them out of Palestine, but this was always imagined as being done voluntarily, with the Jewish state compensating them for leaving. And this idea was only proposed because Herzl believed there would be so many Jews immigrating that the country couldn't materially support both populations. But no mainstream Zionist organization ever adopted expulsion or transfer as official policy or platform. And the frequency of Zionists talking about population transfers increased throughout the 1930s and 40s. But this should be understood in the context of their times, that being increased hostility towards Jews in both the Middle East and Europe. The Arabs had openly talked about expelling or slaughtering the Jews in Palestine since 1920, all the while the Nazis were threatening the existence of Jews. And the Peel Commission's investigation reported that the Arab calls for expelling the Jews were more frequent and explicit, with the Mufti implying that any Jew that they weren't able to deport or expel would be massacred. And Arab rhetoric only became more explicit and hostile the closer we get to partition. It does not matter how many there are, we will sweep them into the sea. The liberation of Palestine is a religious duty for all Muslims. The Islamic and Arab governments should without delay take effective and radical measures. Memoirs gives a succinct description of the Zionist response to the growing Arab radicalism. The Arab violence of 1929, and even more so of 1936 to 39, had a further effect. It put the Jewish community on notice that the Arabs would not countenance the emergence of a Jewish state in Palestine, and would fight against it tooth and nail, and that an Arab minority included in the Jewish state, even if established only on a small part of Palestine, would be disloyal and rebellious and would destabilize or overthrow the state from within. And it was in response to this violent and expulsionist mindset and ideology that the Zionist leadership increasingly turned to the idea of transfer as a solution to the Yeshuv's Arab problem. If this was the enemy and this is what they did and sought, no viable Jewish state could come into existence with a large Arab minority in its midst. Plan Dalet was first proposed by Yigal Yadin of the Haganah's General Staff on March 10, 1948. And so, although ideas of expulsion had been made by various voices through the years, Plan Dalet was a response to the on-the-ground reality. The Zionists were losing the war and needed to secure their borders before the British withdrew, while eliminating hostile elements within before they had to face the Arab armies directly. That's not to say that there weren't bad actors on the Israeli side of this conflict. The Jewish agency in the Haganah had no official policy of expelling Arabs from Palestine. The director of the Lands Department, Yosef Weitz, asked David Ben-Gurion to order the expulsion of the Bedouin Arabs, but he refused. Despite this, Weitz would secretly encourage local Haganah units to take the initiative themselves. However, it ultimately is difficult to parse how much of the Bedouin displacement was a result of the Haganah going out of their way to do so, and how much of it was an in-the-moment battlefield necessity. There were also other factors that made the flight of Arabs a benefit to the Jewish agency and the early Israeli government. Housing construction had slowed during the 1940s due to both a shortage of materials thanks to the war in Europe, as well as the 1939 white paper forbidding the sale of additional land to Jews. This made the agency fear that it wouldn't have enough housing for Jewish refugees waiting in camps. This made the agency fear that it wouldn't have enough housing for Jewish refugees waiting in camps in Europe and Cyprus. But as Arabs abandoned their homes in urban areas, homeless Jews, most of them Holocaust survivors who had escaped from British internment camps, would start squatting in them. As more Arabs fled and more refugees began to show up, the agency took the matter into its own hands, confiscating the abandoned Arab homes and allowing refugee families to live in them. The other big debate around the flight of the Palestinians has to do with alleged radio broadcasts from the Arab states telling the Palestinians to flee, which is a popular narrative you'll see many pro-Israeli writers and pundits repeat. Now, most Arab writers, as well as many anti-Zionist writers, will claim that there were no broadcasts at all. In Christopher Hitchens' chapter of Blaming the Victims, he cites a 1986 article from Memoirs to claim that the broadcast didn't happen, which is not what Morris actually says. According to IDF archives, a couple broadcasts were picked up by Haganah radio operators in Cyprus. What Morris argues in that article is not that the broadcasts didn't happen, but that the broadcasts were not the reason why the Palestinians fled their homes. And this is likely the case because most of the Arab state leaders, including King Abdullah of Jordan and Fazi al-Kawukji of the Arab Liberation Army, had encouraged them to remain or return to their homes, which makes more sense than telling them to leave. They had wanted them to remain in their homes in order to serve as local guides as well as using their towns and villages as supply depots for their armies. It's hard to do that if they're all abandoned. What triggered most of these flights, both before and after Plan Dalet was implemented, was local Arab leaders telling their communities to flee before the Jews showed up and enacted vengeance upon them. And this was usually done after a Jewish military victory nearby. As Abba Eban would later say in his memoirs, it would be more seemly for Israel not to assert unremitting tactical altruism at every stage, but to draw attention to the overriding fact that the flight was the consequence of war, that it would not have taken place without the war, and that those who decided on war are responsible for the ensuing chain of consequences. By late March, the Arabs had cut off western Jerusalem for resupply and reinforcements as well, which put even more pressure on the isolated Jewish outposts in eastern Jerusalem, which was suffering through food shortages and an inability for medical personnel to evacuate the ill or injured. By the 31st, Ben-Gurion orders the Haganah to secure control of Jerusalem, as well as the roads leading in and out of it. The Haganah and Palmach convoys continued delivering arms and reinforcements to isolated settlements despite the frequent ambushes by Arab bands. They also continued their retaliation campaign of targeted bombings and assassinations of Arab leaders. Local ceasefires between Jewish and Arab communities continued to be made and broken by outside elements. It wasn't until late March that the tide appeared to finally be turning, leading to smaller Arab communities who hadn't yet taken up arms choosing not to, as well as others choosing to immediately surrender to the Haganah when confronted. By April, the Haganah had finished their reorganization and were finally ready to take the offensive, which was aided by the arrival of the first shipment of weapons from Czechoslovakia. Most of these weapons were surplus arms from the Nazis, so many of them were decorated with swastikas. The irony of Jews using Nazi-made weapons to prevent another Holocaust was not lost on the Zionists. Some anti-Zionist writers like to use this as proof that they found some secret connection between the Nazis and the Zionists, completely ignoring that it was the communist government of Czechoslovakia that gave them the weapons, with approval from the Soviets. Also, the Arabs were using Nazi surplus weapons as well, and in places like Algeria, anti-French resistance would continue using them into the 1960s. With the British, French, and Americans refusing to sell them weapons, the Haganah got them wherever they could. With the reorganization of the Haganah came a change in strategy. Simply defending convoys was no longer enough. They needed to prevent them from being attacked in the first place, which is why they started targeting Arab villages in accordance with Plan Dalet. But even at this late hour, the Jewish agency didn't cease looking for ways to avoid war. On April 1st, Ben-Gurion sends Joseph Palman to meet with Kabukji, giving him a copy of a letter from the Nazi archives in which the Mufti had been defaming the ALA commander in private correspondence. Kabukji offered the Jews autonomy within a Palestinian federation, but the Jewish agency wasn't interested. Although he was unwilling to make any peace deal that created a Jewish state, he was willing to look the other way while the Haganah dealt with the Mufti's forces. The ALA and Haganah would fight it out in the northern theater, with the Arabs launching attacks against Jewish settlements and the Haganah repelling them, followed by attacking the nearby Arab villages supplying the ALA. On April 8, 1948, one of the most controversial and hotly debated events of the First Arab-Israeli War occurred, the Deir Yassin incident. Depending on which narrative you read, you'll see it described as either a massacre or a battle, with a small few describing it as an incident. There are well-lauded historians on both sides of this debate who have spent large swaths of their career studying and debating this very topic, and I'm not going to resolve it in this one video. So let me give you the most fact-based account I can. The Arab village of Deir Yassin was located between Jerusalem and an old mountain fortress at Al-Kastal, which was occupied by bands loyal to the Mufti. The village leaders had dissuaded local bands from attacking a nearby Jewish settlement, and had refused to host the Arab Liberation Army. Given the frequency of attacks on convoys in the region and the need to capture Al-Kastal, a joint operation between the Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi was planned against Deir Yassin, with the intention of relocating the population. But they disagreed on what they should do with those that refused to leave peacefully. Lehi advocated killing them all, while the Irgun would explicitly order that women and children not be killed. The attack on the village would involve the Irgun and Lehi entering the village itself, while the Haganah and Palmach would provide covering fire. A truck with a loudspeaker would announce their intent to relocate the population of the village before they had entered it. However, there are disputes over whether or not anyone in the village actually heard the message. 130 Irgun and Lehi fighters would enter Deir Yassin, and were quickly pinned down by snipers firing upon them from inside the village. Unsure of where the snipers were or how many hostiles there might be, the Irgun and Lehi resorted to less discriminate tactics, such as tossing grenades and dynamite through windows. after which the homes were blown up and bulldozed, with anybody in the building, dead or alive, buried in the rubble, while some survivors who escaped their homes beforehand were shot. The survivors, mostly children and the elderly, were loaded up on the trucks and dropped off in Arab-controlled eastern Jerusalem. Those survivors would then spread word of what happened at Deir Yassin, and along with it, rumors and myths as well. The Arabs claimed that 250 people were killed, and that the Jews had raped Arab women. However, the Irgun claimed that the kill count was closer to 100, that no rapes had happened, and that they only began firing after they were fired on first by a group of outsiders in the village. Those calling the events at Deir Yassin a massacre tend to take the former position, while those calling it a battle insist that an outsider force was being sheltered, which meant that the village was hostile and thus the relocation of its population was justified. Benny Morse, who falls within the massacre camp, acknowledges in Righteous Victims that there may have been some irregular militias sheltering in the village. I've read other sources claiming that hostiles in Deir Yassin were an ALA platoon from Iraq, or even fighters from Yemen. And most non-Arab historians today reject the claim that women were raped. Arab writers tried to portray this event as emblematic of the overall Zionist agenda and intent, but it ignores all the Arab villages nearby, such as Abba to the west, that were untouched and remains to this day an Arab-majority village. Regardless of the facts in dispute, the event was used for propaganda by both the Arabs and the Jewish Agency. As the story spread across the Arab world via radio and the press, mass demonstrations erupted, resulting in more pogroms against local Jewish communities, and would become a rallying cry for the Palestinian movement. The Jewish Agency used the event for two purposes: to scare Jews away from supporting their rivals in the Irgun and Lehi, as well as to scare Palestinian Arabs. Despite knowing that the Arab account of the event was exaggerated, the Jewish Agency hoped that word of the event spreading would cause many Arabs to flee their homes in fear, hoping that the Haganah wouldn't have to fight them at all, and would actively spread the exaggerated death count and rape allegations, thus causing headaches for historians decades later. The agency would send a formal letter apologizing for the incident to King Abdullah, but popular outrage over the story had forced him into supporting intervention. Unsurprisingly, there would be reprisals for Deir Yassin. World opinion tended to forget that Arab violence had preceded and would also follow the Deir Yassin incident. A few days later, Arab forces attacked a convoy of doctors and nurses, burned alive. Arab militiamen in Jerusalem would attack the Hadassah hospital on Mount Scopus on April 13th, killing 78 and setting the hospital on fire, resulting in most of the bodies being unidentifiable, and the hospital wouldn't be reopened until after the Six-Day War. The same day as the attack on Deir Yassin saw the Haganah attack the fortress at Al-Kastal, capturing it from the Mufti's cousin, Abd al-Qadir, who attempted to recapture it later that same day, but was killed during the attempt. This would allow Tel Aviv to resume delivering supplies and reinforcements to western Jerusalem. The intensity of fighting spread as the British withdrew from posts across the country, resulting in the uninhibited fighting between the Haganah and various local Arab militants. On April 16th, the British pulled out of Safed and Tiberias, with the Palmach and Haganah moving in shortly after the British handed over their fortifications to the Arabs. Once the Haganah secured control of Tiberias, the Arab notables encouraged the Arab community to evacuate the city and flee to Nazareth and Jordan. This happened despite leaders of the Jewish community imploring them to stay, and we'd see similar story play out in Haifa. Haifa was the largest port in Palestine, a railroad hub, and home to the country's only oil refinery, with a pipeline coming from Iraq. The population was split between Jews and Arabs at around 70,000 each. The Arab population was split between Muslims and Christians, as well as between the permanent residents and the seasonal workers who would return to their home villages during the harvest season. The Muslim residents collaborated with the Arab Liberation Army, while the Christians didn't, and were equally on guard toward both the Jews and their Muslim neighbors. The city had been allotted to the Jews in the partition plan, which resulted in fighting breaking out shortly after the UN vote, with the local Arab elites fleeing the city shortly after in November 1947, with over a third of the Arab population gone by the end of January 1948. The wealthy Arabs sold off their assets, and those with movable businesses moved abroad, resulting in increased unemployment amongst those left behind. Because of this, many of the orders to boycott Jewish businesses were not obeyed. The local National Committee tried to discourage Arab flight and punished the violators by burning down their abandoned homes. And on April 18th, the British began evacuating the city, retaining control of the port as the main artery out of the country. The Haganah and Irgun began their own separate operations to capture the city on April 21st, capturing major buildings, while Arab morale quickly collapsed. The Jewish half of the city occupied the high ground, allowing Jewish fighters to fire mortars into the lower Arab half. The Haganah gained control of the city by the 22nd and demanded unconditional surrender from the local National Committee, while the Jewish mayor of Haifa pleaded for the Arabs to remain, promising no harm would come to them. Every effort is being made by the Jews to persuade the Arab populace to stay and carry on with their normal lives, to get their shops and businesses open, and to be assured that their lives and interests will be safe. But the local Arab community had already been demoralized by the flight of their leaders, while the Arab Higher Committee encouraged them to temporarily flee, promising they would bomb the Jews out with the air forces of the Arab states. Most of the remaining Arabs would choose to leave Haifa, with only 3,000 or 4,000 choosing to stay. The fall of Haifa was a huge blow to the Palestinian cause, and threatened to rupture the relationship between the British and Arab states London had hoped to maintain after withdrawal. Foreign Minister Ernest Bevin tells Attlee that he wants British forces to actively side with the Arabs, after an Arab newspaper falsely alleged the Jews had massacred 24,000 Arabs in Haifa. And even after this was discovered to not be true, London was under intense pressure to help the Arabs retain control of Jaffa, sending additional reinforcements from Cyprus, while Bevin ordered commanders to prevent Jewish capture of the city, quote, at all costs. British forces would shell a Haganah position in Tel Aviv and make small air attacks on a Jewish suburb in southern Jaffa. The Irgun would place their fighters under Haganah command for their mission to capture Jaffa, launching their offensive on April 25th. They slowly surrounded the city and eventually launched simultaneous attacks from the north and south, reaching the coast by the 27th. While Arabs fled the central part of the city, the British would fire on Irgun forces with mortars and Spitfires, forcing them to withdraw, but this didn't stop the flight of the Arabs. And as the Zionists were turning the tide of the war on the ground, the Jewish Agency began to turn the tide politically. By early April, most of the world believed that the Jews would lose and thus suffer a second Holocaust. The Arab states were mobilizing their forces and deploying them to their borders with Palestine, but the Arab League was squabbling over post-war scenarios, with the Saudis insisting that all territorial occupations be explicitly labeled as temporary, all the while a resolution was passed that allowed the occupying powers to govern their respective territories as they saw fit, implicitly accepting the reality that they were going to carve up Palestine between themselves, and it was first come, first served. In an attempt to retain some control, the Arab Higher Committee asked Arab civil servants to remain at their posts, hoping to serve as the bureaucratic basis for an Arab Palestinian state. But as major cities began to fall under Haganah control, the tone began to change. The Jewish Agency began setting up a provisional government to take control after the British officially withdrew. The council voted 40 to 18 to formally establish a state upon the mandate's termination, and created positions within the provisional government for any Arab representatives that recognized the Jewish state and wanted citizenship to be involved in, but none were found until after the war ended. The council would name David Ben-Gurion as the Prime Minister and Defense Minister, with Moshe Chertok named Foreign Minister. As the British began receiving pressure from the Arab states, they made one last attempt to push for an alternative to partition at the UN. But by that point, the principle of partition had been accepted by the delegates of the UN, and they did not want the nascent organization going back on one of its own resolutions in the face of violent reprisal. We will reject all attempts to postpone statehood or to impose trusteeship. We shall go on the offensive. We must not merely defend existing Jewish populations and settlements. We shall move out into the open field and capture cities and villages. We shall smash through to Jerusalem. We must accelerate arms supplies. We shall uncompromisingly reject any pressure from delaying the Declaration of Independence by a single day. On April 23rd, a member of Truman's staff would meet with Chaim Weizmann in New York and tell him that the Truman administration would grant the Jewish state immediate recognition so long as they didn't request any U.S. aid. Back in Palestine, the Palmach engaged in a cleanup mission in the north, Operation Broom, mostly dealing with Bedouins near the Sea of Galilee. The Palmach had spread rumors that they were about to receive huge reinforcements, which managed to scare most of them off into the Syrian and Jordanian deserts before coming into contact with Jewish fighters. After weeks of the Jewish quarter of Safed being sieged by the ALA and local militants, the Haganah and Palmach launched an attack on the Arab quarter on May 6th, and by May 11th, they had captured all the police fortifications, after which the Arabs began evacuating without a fight, news of which would trigger flights in nearby villages in the north, most fleeing to Lebanon. The Jews have been making extensive efforts to prevent wholesale evacuation, but the propaganda appears to have had very little effect. Most of the Arabs in the north would flee the country by the 15th. In the south, Muslim Brotherhood militias in Gaza began launching attacks against settlements in the Negev, while the Haganah captured isolated villages still being used to attack convoys. On May 13th, Egyptian and Muslim Brotherhood troops attacked Kfar Darom, the last standing Jewish settlement in what is today the Gaza Strip, leaving only 4 Jewish survivors. The Palmach continued their campaign of securing the highway between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, which required the razing of abandoned Arab villages. But the Palmach and Haganah were running low on manpower due to the British blockade of Jews entering Palestine from Europe, so they were forced to begin recruiting teenagers to make up for the shortage. I very much wanted to spare these 15 and 16-year-olds the horrors of battle, but I was left with no choice. We were now paying for the bloody price of years of neglect. The Yeshiv leadership had not prepared enough weapons of the quality required, and combat forces had not been sufficiently trained. No other people has charged so few, so poorly armed, with gaining and safeguarding its independence. Jordanian forces would enter Palestine before the withdrawal date, with the Arab Legion linking up with local ALA and militias, and launching a frontal attack on the Etzion block of settlements that had been under an on-and-off siege since November. And after the first day of attacks, the individual settlements were cut off from each other. By May 14th, the settlements were overrun, and only 8 of its defenders survived. The 350 civilians in those settlements would be taken prisoner and sent to camps in Jordan. The Jordanians had specific targets in mind, such as the Toynberg hydroelectrical dam along the border, the Dead Sea potash mines providing the Jews explosives, and the port of Haifa. King Abdullah was hoping for a swift military victory with minimal casualties, hoping to convince the Jewish agency that they could be safe under his rule. But his actions were being drowned out by the words of every other Arab faction in Palestine, with radio stations blasting propaganda, promising to slaughter or enslave every last Jew. Despite this, the Jews were in control of most of the territory allotted to them in the partition, and some territory outside of it. In early May, the U.S. State Department tried getting the Jewish agency to postpone their declaration of independence, threatening to withhold the funds from their U.S. branches from going to Tel Aviv. But the Americans found there was basically no functioning mandate government left to actually deal with, leaving them with few options in dealing with the situation. The Palestinian government has generally ceased to function, and central public services no longer exist. In Jewish areas, Jews have taken effective control and are maintaining public services within those areas. Preparations for establishment Jewish state after termination of mandate are well advanced. In Arab areas, only municipal administration continues without any central authority. Morale following Jewish military success is low, with thousands of Arabs fleeing the country. Last remaining hope is the entry of Arab regular armies, spearheaded by the Arab Legion. The Provisional Government's foreign minister, Moshe Chertok, would meet with Secretary of State George Marshall on May 8th. Marshall reiterates his belief that the Jews would most likely lose, to which Chertok retorts that if that turns out to be the case, it's because the U.S. didn't stand behind its commitment to partition. I shall remember all that you have said. I fully appreciate the weight of these considerations. It is not for me to advise you what to do. If it turns out that you are right and you will establish the Jewish state, I'll be happy, but you are undertaking a grave responsibility. Golda Meir secretly meets with King Abdullah again on May 10th, hoping to reconfirm his neutrality, but was told that Jordans would be one of the 5 armies invading Palestine, and that joining his federation was the only way to avoid bloodshed. Have you broken your promise to me after all? When I made that promise, I thought I was in control of my own destiny and can do what I thought right, but since then I have learned otherwise. At some point after their meeting, King Abdullah allegedly said, "If any one person was responsible for the war, it was she, because she was too proud to accept the offer I made her." Golda responds to the alleged quote in her memoirs, "When I think of what would have befallen us as a protected minority in the kingdom of an Arab ruler who was himself murdered by Arabs within just over 2 years, I can't bring myself to regret the fact that I disappointed Abdullah so much that night. But I wish he had been brave enough to stay out of the war. It would have been so much better for him and for us if he had been a little prouder." In the final days before British withdrawal, the leaders of the Jewish agency debated the final things needed before they became a state, such as the wording of their Declaration of Independence, as well as speaking with the leaders of the Haganah to discover could they actually win, to which the head of the Haganah told them they had a 50-50 chance. They approved the final draft of their declaration the morning of May 14th, and that afternoon assembled in the Tel Aviv Museum to do the formal announcement over radio. The British lower their flag over Jerusalem as the sounds of bullets ring out around the city. At 4 p.m. local time, Ben-Gurion reads the Declaration of Independence over the radio. Most of the country was glued to their radios, with the exception of Jerusalem, for whom the electricity had gone out. The land of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here their spiritual, religious, and national identity was formed. Here they achieved independence and created a culture of national and universal significance. Here they wrote and gave the Bible to the world. Exiled from the land of Israel, the Jewish people remained faithful to it in all the countries of their diaspora, never ceasing to pray and hope for their return and the restoration of their national freedom. The recent Holocaust, which engulfed millions of Jews in Europe, proved anew the need to solve the problem of the homelessness and lack of independence of the Jewish people by means of the reestablishment of the Jewish state, which would open the gates to all Jews and endow the Jewish people with equality of status among the family of nations. The survivors of the disastrous slaughter in Europe, and also Jews from other lands, have not desisted from their efforts to reach Eretz Yisrael in face of difficulties, obstacles, and perils, and have not ceased to urge their right to a life of dignity, freedom, and honest toil in their ancestral land. It is the natural right of the Jewish people to lead, as do all other nations, an independent existence in its sovereign state. We hereby proclaim the establishment of the Jewish state in Palestine to be called the State of Israel. The declaration also called for Arab participation in their new government. In the midst of wanton aggression, we yet call upon the Arab inhabitants of the State of Israel to preserve the ways of peace and play their part in the development of the state, on the basis of full and equal citizenship and due representation in all its bodies and institutions, provisional and permanent. President Truman's recognition of Israel would come 11 minutes after the declaration was made, making the U.S. the first country to recognize the sovereignty of the new Jewish state. It was always understood that eventually we would recognize any responsible government the Jews might set up. Partition was not taking place in exactly the peaceful manner I had hoped, to be sure, but the fact that the Jews were controlling the area in which their people lived and that they were ready to administer and defend it. Having gone forward with this against the will of his State Department, Truman would say, to some of the career men of the State Department, this announcement came as a surprise. It should not have been if these men had faithfully supported my policy. I wanted to make it plain that the President of the United States, and not the second or third echelon in the State Department, is responsible for making foreign policy. The Jewish state now existed on paper, and in the hearts and minds of Jews the world over. But keeping that state a reality on the ground would be an entirely different undertaking. I would like to thank my Patreon producer, Ryan Powers, for their continued support of Casual Historian. If you have the means of supporting a content creator and you feel like you get a lot out of these videos, then I would highly encourage you to become a member of the Casual Historian Patreon or a channel member. If you have any questions about this video or topic suggestions for future videos, feel free to leave those down in the comments below. If you're interested in digging deeper into any of the topics I covered, my sources are listed down in the description below. And unfortunately, because of how long this video is, I couldn't fit all of my footnotes into the character limit of the usual video description. So instead, you can find the footnotes in a Google document linked down in the description. If you haven't seen them already, then I highly recommend you watch my previous videos on the history and origins of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And if you're interested in more modern Middle Eastern history, I recommend watching this recent video about what Iran was like before the Islamic Revolution. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.